Hi everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and today I'd like to talk to you about plant defense. That's right, plants are constantly under attack. And so I want to spend a few moments discussing how they defend themselves against this kind of attack. And it's like some of the relationships that plants have with other organisms, like for example, when you look at symbiotic relationships between plants and animals, we often think of them as mutualistic, like for example, pollinators pollinating flowers. And we can think of another great symbiotic relationship of mutualism when we talk about mycorrhizae, in other words, plants and fungi. But some of these relationships are not always mutualistic. Some of them could be, for example, commensalism. In other words, there are some plants that live just upon other plants, and it doesn't seem to harm the plant at all. And it's called being an epiphyte when you're living upon another plant. And then sometimes there's harmful relationships. There's parasitic plants, and so I want you to be thinking about symbiotic relationships when we get into this conversation about plant defense. And it's like, well, why is that? Can't plants defend themselves? Well, sometimes they actually have helpers that help them defend against pathogens or herbivores that are trying to get them. So it's pretty interesting. So plants don't live in isolation, and so their interaction with other animals, other bacteria, and other fungi are not always good. Sometimes they can be harmful. Like, for example, the interaction that plants have with, like, for example, Bambi here. Now, Bambi is very cute and all, but it's a killer. It's an herbivore. And so plant-eating animals, herbaceous kinds of organisms will come and just simply, like, mow these plants away. And so these are not beneficial. This is a predator. And so here's a question, what could plants do to prevent them from being eaten by an herbivore? What can they do to prevent themselves from being attacked by fungi or from other pathogenic bacteria? These are the things that plants are constantly under attack, no matter where they are. Viruses are attacking them, bacteria are attacking them, fungi are attacking them, animals are attacking them. And so plants have developed basically two kinds of defenses that will deter herbivores. You have sort of mechanical ones, like prominent thorns, or you can have little tiny ones that are annoyance to herbivores, or you can make chemical defenses. In other words, like poison, toxic things, like hydrangea. If you're familiar with this popular flower, produces a toxic chemical. And so plants can be like, for example, hemlock can be poisonous. And so animals eating those would simply die. And then, what I find kind of interesting about this chemical defenses is that some plants that we kind of like basil or rosemary or cinnamon or clover or peppermint, I find that those chemicals that those plants produce, if you're an herbivore, there's only so much of that you could possibly eat. And even though they're not necessarily fatal, they deter herbivores from eating them. So plants can make distasteful or toxic, sort of a range right there, preventing organisms from eating them. And so that's kind of cool. And then, frankly, they just physically have defense. Like, for example, their epidermis will prevent pathogens from getting in. And sort of just like us, our skin is sort of the first line of defense. If there's a trauma to the epidermis, in other words, there's an opening, sometimes germs can get in or fungi can get in, or sometimes they come in through the stomata and they get inside and they cause havoc. And then this is the outer epidermis, and then ultimately, if you recall a previous discussion, sort of the endodermis and pericycle will prevent the steel from getting in, for organisms getting into the vascular tissue. So that's kind of interesting. So the next couple of examples I find are very unusual and therefore kind of interesting. Plants produce all sorts of amino acids, and they produce amino acids because they need that in order to produce their proteins. And so they get nitrogen from the soil and they produce their amino acids. But are you ready for this? Some plants will, instead of producing the amino acid arginine, they also produce this unusual amino acid. It's difficult to pronounce, so I'm not even going to attempt it. And so what happens is when an insect comes along and it eats this particular plant and it takes in this sort of oddball amino acid, which if you look at it closely, if this is the base structure of an amino acid here, and here's the R group extending out, arginine and this guy look very similar. So it's sort of like it's not a true isomer, but it's similar. And so what happens is when the animal comes and it eats that, and if it eats enough of it, it's difficult for that animal to sort of distinguish between arginine and this. And so what happens is it'll use this faulty amino acid in its polypeptide sequence, and therefore it'll produce a protein that has sort of an unnatural primary structure and therefore an unnatural secondary tertiary structure, and so it'll produce dysfunctional proteins. How do you like that? So then the insect dies as a result of incorporating this weird amino acid. I find that to be fascinating. This one, it's got to top it all. This one is some plants, okay, see this leaf right here? Some plants will actually, in their own defense, recruit other animals, other predatory animals to help defend. And so who's eating leaves more than a caterpillar? So a caterpillar's coming along and it's chomp, 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 chomp. So just this wounding mechanism gets into when the cells are damaged, they produce sort of inside the cell a cascade of secondary messengers that translates, or even the saliva of the caterpillar translates to these secondary messages, which will then have the plant increase its production of a volatile chemical. Volatile means that it's going to evaporate and it's going to actually disperse from the leaf. And so basically, when the caterpillar is eating the leaf produces a gas that then goes and recruits parasitoid wasps. So you ready for this? The wasp is flying along, bee, 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 and it smells this and it says, uh-oh, I'm being called into the game here. It's sort of like Batman looking up into the sky and seeing the bat symbol up in the cloud. And so are you ready for this? The wasp comes and you're like, what's the wasp going to do? Well, the wasp comes. And what does it do? It lands on top of the caterpillar. It doesn't eat it per se, but it stabs it and injects it with eggs. So the female wasp lays its eggs inside the caterpillar, and then when the larvae grow up inside, they start eating the caterpillar, and they basically destroy the caterpillar from inside out, and so they eat their organic containers. Ooh. Isn't that wild? That's a great defense from the plant, wouldn't you say? And then some things like, for example, like lima beans, as you can see down here, when they're being attacked by mites, they'll produce some of these volatile chemicals to warn their neighboring plants that they're under attack so they can defend against them. And then finally, one of the great examples, I think, most interesting one of all time is sort of in the tropical rainforest. You've got these swollen thorn acacia trees. And then you've got these acacia ants, and it's weird. If you know this story, it's like this acacia. When you look at this, like in the rainforest of Costa Rica, you see that it's sitting there and like it doesn't have any chew marks on it. It doesn't seem like any bugs are eating it, which is kind of unusual. So you're thinking, I don't know, maybe it's producing a toxic chemical. So what biologists have done is they've taken the acacia and they've crushed up the needles and the leaves, and they've tried to look for that, and they don't find any chemical. And then sometimes they'll grow these acacia trees like in a greenhouse, and then they'll introduce some predatory bugs like a grasshopper or something like that. The grasshopper just totally eats it. I'm like, what's going on? And so what's happening like in the real community that's protecting the acacia? And so further observation, notice that there's all kinds of ants crawling around the acacia. And so this is a great example of not only using ants as a defense mechanism, But it's a great example of coevolution. And coevolution is when organisms have the selection pressure that organisms have evolved are in response not to the physical environment but to each other. So simply said, that the ants are so symbiotically in this tight relationship with the acacia tree that basically the plant is producing things just for the ants, and the ants are producing things just for the plant. And it's so unique, it's so specialized that there's no other way to explain it other than they've co-evolved together. And so the reason that they're doing the things that they're doing, producing what they're producing, and behaving the way they're behaving is that they're interacting with one another as a result of coevolution. It's a great example of this. And so plants and insects represent a classic case of coevolution. It's not just pollinators and flowers, which is also coevolution, but this is another cool one. This is of ants and the acacia. And so take a look at this. This match is such a close one that in Central America, these trees produce these hollow thorns. And what's interesting is the ants actually live in there, and they bear their children inside there. And so they're like, the acacia provides little homes for them, like little apartments on there for them to live. And in response, they defend against any sort of, not only any kind of bug that's trying to eat the acacia, but even any other plants that are trying to compete with it. And so it goes even beyond that, in that the plant, the acacia, produces little sugary nectars, and they also produce like little packets of protein to feed the ants. And so it's mutually beneficial. So I can only say so much about it. I have to show you this video that I found on this amazing relationship that the acacia has with the ants.
Whenever a huge tree falls in the Costa Rican rainforest, a gap of sunlight is formed in the canopy. New life competes for this light, like this vine racing this sapling upward. But there's one tree that never has any competition, thanks to an incredible symbiotic relationship it shares with an ant. The swollen thorn acacia and its namesake, the acacia ant, have developed harmonious roles in each other's lives. The ant's role is as protector. If any of those vines try to steal the acacia's light, the ant's security guards go to work.
The ant is attacking
a few
competitor.
Good chomps on the vine stems, and it's lights out for the vine. The ants don't stop there. This relatively huge grasshopper may think it's going to take a few bites out of the non-poisonous acacia.
See, non-poisonous.
But the ants take a few bites out of it instead.
The animals help to defend. Incredible. So the plant benefits
from the ant.
They throw
in a few stings for good measure.
But what do the ants get in return?
In exchange for all this protection, the tree takes on the provider role. It gives the insect everything it needs in terms of food and shelter. These little nodules, or nectaries, secrete a sweet nectar for the adult ants to eat. And these brownish pods at the end of some leaves are the perfect, nutrient-packed food for the ants' developing young, called larvae.
So there's important amino acids in
The
there.
acacia ant larvae live down hollowed-out thorns at the base of the acacia leaves.
Incredible.
Some will eventually grow into adults with wings and will fly off to replicate this evolutionary masterpiece in a new acacia.
Yeah, I hope you enjoyed that. That is just simply over the top, if you ask me. It's a really cool example of plant defense. So they're not themselves defending themselves by producing a volatile chemical, or they're not producing a chemical defense of any kind, but rather they're recruiting ants to defend them. Crazy. So another really cool example of biology, and maybe one of the reasons why we love biology, because of these great coevolutionary alliances that we can see. Well, I hope you enjoyed this brief discussion of plant defense. Thanks for watching.